And that's when everything unraveled. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The echo of expensive leather shoes against polished marble floors faded as the crowd filed into the lecture hall. A space built for prestige, not inclusivity. Corinthian columns lined the back wall like silent judges. The overhead lights, too white and too sterile, poured down on rows of mahogany benches filled with students from across the country. Some were visiting scholarship kids. Others were elite prep school products, bred for moments like this. But all of them, regardless of background, had their eyes on the tall, silver-haired man at the front of the auditorium, Dr. Edwin Whitmore, a towering figure in the world of advanced mathematics and a tenured professor at the Ivy League institution hosting this so-called Outreach Day. To the institution's board, this event was meant to show their commitment to diversity. In reality, it was a polished parade of tokenism. The crowd included a group of hand-selected black students from low-income schools, bussed in for photo ops and PR fluff. Their bright eyes scanned the room nervously, clothes too modest for this polished setting. Some clutched notebooks. Others fidgeted. No one felt welcome. Dr. Whitmore adjusted his lapel mic with mechanical precision. His gray-blue eyes swept across the audience with a chill that made even the temperature feel colder. Mathematics, he began, voice clear and deliberate, is not democratic. It does not care about your zip code, your skin color, or your dreams. It rewards brilliance, and brilliance alone. There was a shift in the room. Some students sat straighter. Others curled inward. A murmur of discomfort passed through the row of visiting students, from Oak Ridge Middle School, mostly black kids from the poorest parts of the city. On the screen behind him, Whitmore revealed a complex equation, a brutal knot of variables, proofs, and matrices, dense and unforgiving. This, he continued, is the Halpern conjecture, unsolved for 30 years. Graduate students have failed. Professors have failed. I've brought it here to make a point. You see, even among our brightest minds, it remains untouched. So when your teachers, your mentors, your activist YouTubers tell you that everyone is equal in potential, they are respectfully incorrect. There it was, not subtle, not coded, just raw academic racism cloaked in cold rationality. Gasps rippled through the auditorium. Some of the elite students smirked behind their hands. One student from Jefferson Tech High shot a look of embarrassment at his peers from Oak Ridge, whispering something under his breath. Phones discreetly lifted. The moment had begun to go viral before it had even finished unfolding. Dr. Whitmore tapped the board. Anyone. I'll offer extra credit, or in your case he glanced directly at the Oak Ridge group, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to prove everyone wrong. Laughter, nervous and sharp, cut through the tension. The Oak Ridge students exchanged glances. One girl, Zara, visibly recoiled, hugging her backpack as if to shrink. Another boy, Darius, kept his head down, scribbling notes furiously, pretending not to hear. For a full minute, no one moved. And then, silence. The kind of silence that doesn't settle, but suffocates. It made the air feel too thick to breathe. Made the humiliation feel etched into the stone walls of that hall. Dr. Whitmore let the silence linger. He stepped back from the board, arms crossed, letting the implied conclusion draw itself. I thought so, he said finally. Some equations, like some rooms, simply aren't meant.
Then came the voice.
I can try. It was soft. Not a shout, not a challenge. Just 5 words, spoken by a child. Heads turned. A shuffle rippled through the back of the auditorium. There, standing just a head taller than the seat he'd been sitting in, was a boy, maybe 10 years old, wearing worn sneakers and an oversized sweater with the sleeves bunched at his wrists. His name tag, half peeling from his chest, read Elijah Monroe. He didn't look like a math genius. He looked like someone who hadn't eaten breakfast. The entire room turned toward him, the way predators notice a deer stepping into open ground. Dr. Whitmore tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. I'm sorry, he said, each word dipped in condescension. Elijah stepped forward, no longer whispering. I said I can try. Gasps again, this time louder. A few students chuckled. A professor from the back muttered something about childcare. But Elijah kept walking, down the aisle, each step stiff with fear but firm with something else too. Something unshakable. Dr. Whitmore gestured to the board with mock courtesy. Be my guest, young man. I assume you've brought your own chalk. Laughter this time. Even louder. One of the cameras zoomed in. Elijah blinked. I have a marker. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a black Expo pen. The cheap kind. The kind schools buy in bulk and never replace until they dry out. A quiet hush returned as he stepped up to the board. Dr. Whitmore leaned in slightly, whispering something only Elijah could hear. "Don't embarrass yourself, boy." Elijah looked up at him. He didn't flinch. He didn't nod. He just uncapped the marker. Behind him, a sea of skeptical eyes watched as this 10-year-old, smaller than the podium, out of place in every way, began to draw something entirely unexpected on the whiteboard. But he didn't start where the professor had started. He rewrote the entire equation, repositioning it, reframing it. He wasn't solving the Halpern conjecture the way others had tried. He was dismantling the assumptions behind the original proof. Dr. Whitmore's smirk began to fade. Line by line, Elijah moved like a kid possessed. But it wasn't random. There was rhythm in his movements, logic behind his structure. Where others saw complexity, he saw clarity. Gasps turned to silence. Then silence turned to confusion. Then realization. A graduate student sitting in the third row mouthed something unintelligible and grabbed his phone to take a photo, only to be swatted by the TA sitting next to him. And finally, as Elijah completed the last line, a silence fell so heavy, it felt like gravity. The equation was complete, balanced, proven, but no one clapped, because no one moved. No one understood how. Dr. Whitmore's mouth opened as if to speak, but nothing came out. He stepped forward, looked at the board, looked at Elijah. Then, without a word, he grabbed the eraser and violently wiped the entire board clean. The room erupted, but not with applause. With noise. Outrage. Confusion. Whispers. Phones came back out. Half the students stood. A girl screamed, "Wait, what are you doing?" But Dr. Whitmore raised his hands. "Thank you for attending today," he said coldly. "Let's return to our scheduled programming." The lights dimmed. The next slide popped up, but no one was paying attention to it anymore. Elijah stood there, marker in hand, eyes wide but jaw tight. He didn't cry. He didn't run. He just stood there. 10 years old, erased from history in real time. And in that moment, a storm was brewing far beyond the walls of that prestigious auditorium. Because tucked among the crowd, unnoticed, sat a sophomore named Lila Pierce. She had recorded the entire thing, and she wasn't planning to keep it to herself. As silence settles, one tiny voice from the back whispers, "I can try." The air inside the auditorium did not settle after the erasure of the solution. It thickened, as if the very walls had absorbed the humiliation and were now returning it in silent echoes. The crowd remained suspended between disbelief and discomfort, a collective awareness that something irreversible had happened. Yet no one wanted to be the first to acknowledge it. Elijah remained near the board, still and small beneath the blinding white lights, not yet returning to his seat, not yet retreating, as if his presence itself challenged the room to confront what it had just witnessed. He did not tremble. He did not search for approval. He simply existed in that moment, with a quiet steadiness that unsettled those who had already dismissed him as insignificant. Around him, adults shifted in their seats not out of empathy, but out of the uneasy recognition that the narrative they had constructed about who belonged in such spaces had cracked in front of them. The sequence of moments that had led him there replayed itself across the consciousness of the room. The careful steps he had taken down the aisle, the way he had threaded his way through towering bodies and expensive blazers, the subtle widening of eyes as people realized he was not lost, not wandering, but determined. Even before he reached the front, judgment had met him in layers, measured glances from students who considered themselves future leaders of industry, exhausted indifference from faculty who treated outreach as charity work rather than access, and quiet resentment from those who believed opportunity should remain exclusive. Every pair of eyes on him had become a silent verdict. The phones that rose in incremental sequence did not capture pride or curiosity. They captured spectacle, framing him as an anomaly rather than a mind. He had experienced that sensation before, in school hallways where teachers praised test scores while simultaneously doubting their origin. In gifted program evaluations where admiration was accompanied by suspicion. In rooms where excellence from him seemed to require a footnote explaining how rare it was instead of how earned. His silence had become his protection. He had learned to think deeper and speak less, because every word from him was weighed differently, interpreted through a filter that diminished rather than amplified. Yet something about this room, this polished space designed to intimidate, had drawn out a courage rooted not in defiance but in necessity. He had not walked forward to prove anyone wrong. He had walked forward because the equation on the board had reached for his mind the way music reaches for a musician. As he approached the platform earlier, he had felt the echo of his mother's steady presence in the corners of memory, not as a speech or a command, but as the quiet confidence she carried on days when the world felt particularly unwelcoming. He carried with him the sound of late-night apartment silence broken only by the hum of old appliances and the scratch of pencil against paper as he worked through problems under dim light. He carried the weight of teachers who alternated between calling him gifted and problematic depending on who was watching, of administrators who invited him to STEM competitions for diversity optics, while limiting his access to advanced materials. He did not walk through the aisle as a prodigy. He walked through it as a child who understood too early that brilliance alone was never enough to be allowed inside. The adults in the room had misread his quietness as fragility. But beneath that stillness was an interior world full of patterns and geometry, and intuitive leaps that felt more natural than conversation. He had observed the board from the back of the auditorium, and recognized something not in the symbols themselves, but in the structure around them, an assumption embedded in the framework that others had not questioned. His decision to step forward was not sudden. It was the culmination of countless moments where he remained silent because spaces were not built for him to speak. When he finally rose, his steps were not hesitant, they were deliberate, as if each one rewrote the boundaries of where he was expected to stand. The room had reacted to his approach before he ever touched the marker. Laughter disguised as lightheartedness drifted across rows, the kind meant to soften cruelty by calling it humor. Some smiled in a way that pretended encouragement, yet carried a subtext of prediction. Screens recorded with the enthusiasm of people certain they were capturing another example of overreach, a novelty that would soon become a punchline. He felt every lens on him like heat, but he did not break stride. The distance from his seat to the board was not long, yet it stretched into something monumental, bridging two worlds that rarely touched on equal terms. Even standing at the front, he did not rush. He studied the remaining traces of chalk dust on the board, the faint strokes that lingered where his erased work had once been. The professor's presence hovered beside him, tall and composed, radiating a rigid certainty shaped by decades of unchallenged authority. The professor's gaze did not carry curiosity, only ownership. To him, the board was not a space for exploration. It was a pedestal that defined who deserved visibility. Elijah sensed the chill in that posture, the unspoken message that this invitation was not genuine opportunity, but a test designed to fail. The whisper that drifted close to his ear was not loud enough for the crowd, but its meaning cut with precision. It did not question his math. It questioned his place. It reduced him not to a student, not to a thinker, but to a risk, a spectacle that must be prevented from disrupting the narrative. It carried an old tone that had existed in classrooms and offices, and institutions long before this day. A tone that insisted some brilliance should remain invisible. The words did not shock him. What unsettled him instead was the ease with which they were spoken inside a hall that claimed to celebrate merit. He felt the marker in his hand like a fragile instrument, its plastic shell cool against his fingers, its promise both empowering and dangerous. The aisle behind him seemed longer now, the escape route shrinking beneath the expanding judgment of the room. He could sense the quiet shifting of students who leaned forward not with anticipation of discovery, but with anticipation of mistake. For many of them, failure from him would reaffirm the order they believed was natural. For a few, success would threaten the foundation of how they measured themselves. He understood, without anyone saying it aloud, that his attempt was not just about solving an equation. It was about whether someone like him was permitted to occupy the center of this room without apology. The internal conflict swelled, not in words but in the careful tightening of his breath. He remembered the afternoons when he solved problems on scrap paper at the public library. Because his school ran out of supplies, the way librarians would watch him longer than others, the subtle signals that curiosity from him was treated as anomaly rather than promise. He remembered talent programs described as opportunities while quietly segregating students into tracks that rarely intersected with privilege. Those memories did not weaken him. They clarified. They made the board in front of him feel less like an obstacle, and more like a statement waiting to be rewritten. Around the auditorium, impatience began to ripple. To the audience, his stillness appeared as hesitation, but within it lived a deep precision. He did not approach mathematics as a performance. He approached it as language, one he had learned to speak fluently in solitude, without applause, without validation. Yet the environment had turned that language into a spectacle, reducing his process to a moment that had to prove more than the problem itself. The professor's silent expectation pressed closer, as if urging a mistake, as if silently anticipating the moment he could reclaim control of the narrative. In that suspended second before the marker touched the board, Elijah felt the weight of every gaze converge upon his small frame, felt the divide between who he was and who the room assumed him to be. The auditorium no longer resembled a place of learning. It felt like a stage constructed to measure the limits of permission. The lights hummed with sterile intensity, the polished wood gleamed with indifference, and somewhere in the back, cameras waited to transform his effort into contempt rather than understanding. His hand rose anyway, not fueled by confidence or defiance, but by the quiet conviction that his thinking did not require permission. And as his fingers tightened and the marker hovered inches from the white surface, the professor leaned in just enough for his breath to brush Elijah's ear, delivering a final condescending warning meant to shrink him before he could begin, a warning that insisted he should not dare to embarrass himself. Boy, sealing the moment in a chilling intimacy that transformed the room from academic theater into something far more revealing, and leaving the space suspended on the brink of what would happen the instant the marker finally met the board. The marker finally touched the whiteboard, releasing a faint squeak that sliced through the tension-strung auditorium. All eyes locked onto Elijah's hand as he began to write slowly at first. Not from hesitation but precision. He worked differently than the graduate students who had previously attempted the problem, where they had filled space with brute force calculations. Elijah's strokes were lean, almost minimalist, as though he were drawing from a different reservoir of thought. His process was elegant, unfolding like a hidden melody only he could hear, and yet the murmurs began almost immediately. Is he even doing it right? Looks like guesswork. That can't be the correct approach. Each whisper, each undertone of condescension, sharpened the edge of the atmosphere. A cluster of upper-level math students sat arms crossed, squinting at the board, trying to decode the logic behind Elijah's rearrangement of the equation. They couldn't see the forest for the trees. What looked like improvisation was, in truth, intuition born from relentless self-study, a gift sharpened not by access, but necessity. Elijah didn't think like someone taught to climb within the boundaries of a curriculum. He thought like someone who had broken free of the system entirely, and that terrified the room more than they could admit. A girl in the third row laughed under her breath. This is what happens when you let anyone think they can just walk in and solve legacy problems. Her friend nodded, not even watching the board, focused more on Elijah's skin than his work. But Elijah didn't hear them. Not really. Not this time. He was lost in the logic. The board became less a display, and more a map he was unlocking in real time. His eyes scanned rapidly between symbols, cross-referencing identities, and alternative formulations. He'd long since realized the conjecture wasn't unsolvable. It was just misunderstood. What Whitmore had presented as a pristine, elegant problem was in fact fundamentally flawed at its base. And instead of hammering through it, Elijah shifted the ground beneath it, gently adjusting the assumptions that upheld its false complexity. With every line he wrote, the room grew more restless. Professors leaned forward in their seats. Graduate students whispered nervously. Phones that had once recorded for amusement now focused with concern. A few faculty members whispered to each other in the corner, unsure whether to intervene or simply let the moment implode under its own audacity. Dr. Whitmore stood to the side, arms folded, his face carefully blank, but the tension in his jaw, the faint narrowing of his eyes, betrayed something deeper. Not fear of being wrong, but fear of losing control over the illusion of intellectual superiority he had cultivated for decades. Still, Elijah kept writing. Each stroke of his marker was confident now, more assured, as though the rhythm of the solution was revealing itself to him with divine clarity. He used symbols most students in the room hadn't mastered yet. At one point he paused, not because he was unsure, but because he realized he was about to jump several steps ahead, and he wanted to slow down, to let them catch up. His brain moved faster than the room could follow. But it was during that pause that a voice rang out sharply from the back. He's copying it from somewhere. All heads turned toward the source. A tall, smug boy with slick hair and a Columbia sweatshirt, who hadn't stopped sneering since Elijah stood up. Probably memorized a fake proof from Reddit, the boy added, loud enough for it to echo. Elijah turned slightly, eyes calm, unshaken. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. The equation would speak for itself. Still, the damage was done. Doubt was a virus in rooms like this, and now it had a foothold. Dr. Whitmore didn't stop the accusation. He didn't reprimand the heckler. Instead, he shifted slightly, turning his full attention back to Elijah, not in curiosity, but surveillance. He moved closer, as though his proximity might influence the outcome. "Are you quite certain about that step?" he asked coolly, pointing to a section Elijah had just written. Elijah glanced at it, nodded once, and replied with quiet conviction. "Yes, it resolves the misalignment in your base transform. That's why the original model fails." The professor's brow twitched. There it was. The fracture. The subtle slip in the facade. Because Elijah hadn't just solved the equation, he'd exposed its designer. Now Elijah reached the final set of lines. His hand no longer trembled. His expression was focused, not proud, not performative. He had nothing to prove to the room. He had only to finish what he started. Step by step he annotated the resolution, not with long-winded derivations, but with compact, dense proofs that collapsed layers of assumed impossibility. Each symbol landed like a silent explosion, ripping through decades of institutional gatekeeping. The final symbol landed with a quiet tap. He stepped back. The board was full, but uncluttered. It radiated clarity, and for a brief, electrifying moment, the room went dead silent. A single breath could be heard, the inhalation of understanding that something extraordinary had happened. Even the harshest skeptics were frozen in place. Those who mocked now stared at the board with their mouths slightly open, struggling to comprehend what had unfolded. Then movement. Dr. Whitmore stepped forward, quickly, too quickly, and without saying a word picked up the eraser. The room gasped. "Elijah," someone blurted, but it was too late. With one violent swipe, the professor began scrubbing the board clean. The ink was fresh, and the black smudges spread like bruises across the surface. "Stop," a student shouted. Another tried to rise, but a faculty member motioned her down. "No recording during presentations," someone said weakly, trying to maintain order. But the erasure continued. Fast. Angry. Sweeping away the proof before it could be analyzed, before it could be verified, before it could be remembered. Elijah stood frozen. Not with fear, with realization. He had done something no one expected. And now they were burying it. The whiteboard was cleared within seconds. The final symbol, the one that completed the solution, vanished beneath a cloud of eraser dust and ego. Dr. Whitmore turned around, perfectly composed again, as if nothing had happened. "Well," he said with a thin smile, "that was an admirable attempt." The word attempt lingered like a slap. A low, rising tension began to swell in the audience. Some students looked furious, others confused. Phones were back out, now recording openly. Whispers became murmurs. Murmurs became protests. But Whitmore raised his hands like a conductor silencing an orchestra. "Thank you for your enthusiasm," he said to the crowd. "Now let's return to the lecture." He clicked his remote, and a new slide appeared. But no one was looking at the screen anymore. They were looking at Elijah, still standing near the board, marker now hanging at his side, eraser dust swirling in the air between him and history. He turned slowly, and began walking back to his seat. No applause. No acknowledgement. Just the invisible weight of a room where truth had been silenced by status. But he didn't walk with shame. He walked with the quiet clarity of someone who understood exactly what had just happened. And in the back corner of the auditorium, unnoticed by most, a girl named Lila pressed a button on her phone. The one she had kept recording from her lap the entire time. She didn't raise it. She didn't shout. She just hit upload. When Elijah completes the final step, the professor freezes, then violently wipes the board clean. The night after the lecture hall incident did not dissolve into silence the way ordinary days do. Instead, it expanded into a restless current that flowed through dorm rooms, faculty lounges, and comment threads with a speed that felt almost predatory. Screens glowed across campus as short clips from the auditorium began circulating, cut and trimmed in a way that reshaped the narrative into something more palatable for those already convinced of their own sequeur. The video that spread first was only 37 seconds long, enough to show Elijah standing at the board, enough to show Dr. Whitmore stepping in beside him, enough to show the professor wiping the board with a single dismissive swipe, but not enough to reveal the full truth that had existed between those frames. The caption beneath it read, "Professor gently corrects child's math attempt. Audience applauds humility." There was no applause in the actual moment, yet the suggestion alone rewrote memory for thousands before the morning sun had even risen. Within hours, the clip migrated beyond campus servers and onto social platforms where strangers dissected a moment they had never witnessed, confident in interpretations that aligned with pre-existing biases. Comments flooded in beneath the reposts, with a chilling familiarity. "This is why academic standards are necessary. That boy shouldn't have been up there in the first place. Participation trophies don't belong in math. Threads stacked beneath those lines, layered with coded language that hid cruelty beneath civility, turning Elijah from a child into a symbol people could attack without consequence. Those who watched only the edited angle saw a professor stepping in to correct, not suppress. They saw a child learning, not being erased. The camera had been positioned just enough to obscure the solution, a framing choice that transformed truth into narrative weapon. It wasn't long before commentators began turning their critiques into pseudo-analyses. A self-proclaimed education blogger stitched the clip into a reaction video, nodding solemnly as he declared that this was a teachable moment about confidence without competence, speaking with the authority of someone who believed observation granted ownership. He paused the frame on Elijah's face and zoomed in, as if magnification could manufacture insight. "The professor shows patience," he said, his tone drenched in condescension. "This is how mentorship works." No one questioned why a mentor would erase instead of explain. No one asked why the child never spoke. The silence in the clip became evidence, and in the absence of truth, the world filled the gaps with prejudice. Meanwhile, Elijah woke to the artificial light of an aging kitchen bulb, and the smell of reheated coffee, drifting from the counter where his mother sat staring at her phone. Alicia Munro had never been someone who began her day with news feeds. Yet that morning she could not tear herself away. Her tired fingers scrolled past comment after comment, each one striking like a whisper of judgment from people who knew nothing about her son. Strangers who discussed him as though he were a case study, instead of a child who still needed help tying the loose knots in his sneakers. She read words that did not mention race directly, yet cut along racial lines all the same, language crafted to sound rational while carrying the same old insinuations about where brilliance could and could not belong. "Elijah," she said softly, not to scold or warn, but to steady herself. He looked up, unaware of the storm unfolding in distant spaces of the internet. He did not see the clip yet. He saw only his mother's expression, not anger, not shock, but a deep ache that came from years of anticipating harm long before it arrived. When she asked what had happened after he returned home silent the previous evening, he had answered with brief honesty, his voice even. He erased it, he had said, before anyone could read it. She had wanted to believe that the world would at least allow truth to sit quietly, even when challenged. Now the screen showed her otherwise. On campus, public relations staff were already alert, crafting statements before questions were asked. Emails circulated internally, filled with polished language about context, outreach learning environments, and protecting academic integrity. The video, they insisted, must be seen as a moment of guided correction. None of them had been in the room long enough to witness the hush, the erasure, the disbelief, yet they shaped the story as though they owned it. In one meeting, a board member suggested inviting Elijah back for a confidence-building workshop, as if the real wound lay in his self-perception rather than the institutional act that had erased him in front of hundreds. The words sounded compassionate on paper and hollow in spirit, like a hand extended only after pushing someone from the edge. The conversation among students split in predictable ways. Some reposted the clip with captions, like "painful but fair," echoing the professor's narrative. Others shared it with outrage, muffled beneath caution, worrying that challenging the institution too openly might affect their standing. In the Oak Ridge Middle School group chat, the visiting students watched in silence, each replaying not just the footage, but the feeling of being in that room, the weight of the laughter, the unease in the air, the certainty that if they spoke up, they would be dismissed as emotional, not observant. Darius typed a message. He solved it, then deleted it before hitting send, unsure whether truth would help or simply deepen the isolation. But the most unsettling reaction came from a subtle shift in tone that crept into media outlets by afternoon. A local news site published a short article, using the clip as its central source. Its headline read, "Young visitor attempts complex proof, esteemed professor guides him through correction." The body described Elijah as eager, overconfident, and spirited, words that sounded harmless until placed beside descriptions of Whitmore as renowned, measured, and mentor-like. The piece concluded with a statement about the importance of realistic academic aspiration, shaping the world into a place where aspiration was only realistic when filtered through privilege. Through all of this, Elijah moved quietly through his day, unaware that his name was being discussed in rooms and threads far beyond his neighborhood. When his mother finally showed him the clip that afternoon, he watched with a stillness that carried both hurt and restraint. He recognized the moment, yet the version he saw on screen felt like a distorted echo of reality. Where his proof should have stood, the camera framed only the professor's back, and the erasure, where the gasp of the audience had lived, The audio had been muted beneath gentle piano stock music, added by someone eager to soften discomfort. "That isn't what happened," he said, his voice thin but steady, not as protest but as a statement of fact that landed with a weight far greater than its volume. Alessia wanted to tear the screen from existence. She wanted to reach into every comment and pull back the humanity people had stripped away, but instead she placed her hand on Elijah's shoulder, not to reassure him. Reassurance would have been dishonest, but to remind him he was seen fully and truthfully, inside the walls of their small apartment, even as the world reduced him to a caricature. "They weren't ready to see you," she murmured, not as a comfort, but as a quiet indictment of a world that insisted readiness was a virtue rather than a barrier. Yet beneath the noise, beneath the falsely narrated edits and mislabeled commentary, something else was moving. Small at first, almost invisible. On a lesser-known student forum, a single post appeared from someone who had been in the audience. It did not accuse or dramatize. It simply asked, did anyone else notice he had already finished before the board was wiped? The question hung there, unanswered for minutes, that felt like hours. Slowly, others began to respond, cautiously, anonymously, confirming details, recalling fragments, piecing together memory in opposition to the circulating myth. The thread grew not with outrage, but with unease, as students realized that the clip everyone shared was not a reflection of truth, but a carefully managed illusion. And at the center of that emerging fracture stood Lila Pierce, the sophomore who had kept her phone angled low in her lap, recording everything from the moment Elijah picked up the marker to the moment the board was erased. She had watched the edited version spread that morning in disbelief, feeling the surreal dissonance of seeing reality rewritten before her eyes. At first she hesitated, not out of fear, but from the heavy awareness that releasing the full video would force a confrontation the institution had spent years avoiding. She replayed her footage again and again, each time feeling the weight of choice press harder against her chest. By late afternoon, she no longer questioned what needed to be done. In a quiet dorm room lit only by the glow of her laptop, she opened the file, trimmed nothing, muted nothing, and uploaded the full recording, not to the school network, not to a filtered forum, but to a public platform where context could no longer be controlled. Her finger hovered for a moment over the button, not out of doubt, but out of recognition that this single action would shift the story from rumor to reckoning. Then she pressed publish, and in the brief stillness that followed, before the world had yet discovered the truth hiding inside that uncut footage, the internet, and everything tethered to it, stood on the edge of a rupture it could no longer ignore. The moment Elijah's full video went live, silence ceased to be an option. The internet, once bloated with smug justifications and coded critiques, jolted as if a curtain had been ripped away mid-performance. There was no music overlay this time, no flattering cutaways, just raw, unfiltered truth. The recording showed Elijah walking to the board with quiet courage, working with an intellect far beyond his years, and most damningly, it captured the professor erasing the solution, not after a mistake, but after its completion, fast, aggressive, deliberate. It was an academic execution cloaked in authority, and now it was public. Alessia Monroe wasn't on TikTok. She didn't spend her nights scrolling through viral outrage or trending debates. But that morning, her phone buzzed without mercy. Texts, missed calls, voicemails, strange numbers from across the country. Elijah sat at the kitchen table pouring syrup over pancakes that had gone cold, while Alessia stood against the wall holding her phone like a live wire. She wasn't shocked by the video. She'd heard the full story from Elijah already, watched it behind his eyes since the moment he came home. What shook her was how fast the world moved when truth wasn't quiet anymore. The comments now told a different story. Rage mixed with guilt, with shame, with belated recognition. They erased brilliance in front of a crowd. He solved it. Why won't they admit it? This isn't about math anymore. The video hit 1 million views within 12 hours, and every second of it was a rebuke to the institution that had once controlled the narrative. But instead of issuing apologies, the system doubled down. By midday, Alessia received an unexpected phone call from Elijah's school district office. A request to come in for an urgent conversation. No explanation, just urgency. She arrived wearing the same black hoodie she'd thrown on in the morning. Tired eyes shadowed by hours of reading and watching her son's name get dissected by strangers. She was met by Principal Carmen Hayes, the same woman who had smiled politely at every parent-teacher night, but never once offered Elijah access to the gifted testing programs he qualified for. Seated next to her were 2 unfamiliar men in suits, one from the district's communications team, the other introduced vaguely as a community liaison. Their words were careful, practiced. They didn't say the word viral. They didn't say racism. What they said was worse. We just want to ensure this situation doesn't escalate into something unmanageable. Alicia narrowed her eyes. Define unmanageable. The man in the blue tie leaned forward. Public perception is powerful, Ms. Monroe, and with the attention this video is getting, it might help everyone if we focus the narrative on a learning opportunity. She stared at him, unmoving. Principal Hayes jumped in quickly, voice falsely sweet. What we mean is, perhaps the message should be about Elijah's potential, not about controversy or confrontation. Highlight how proud we all are of him. Alicia's jaw clenched. Proud? You didn't even include him in the STEM fair last month. You said the spots were full. The woman blinked. The man in the gray suit shifted. We understand your frustration, he said carefully. But we also need to consider the school's reputation, especially in a climate like this. There it was. The system wasn't asking her to protect her son. It was asking her to protect its image. They wanted the edges softened, the racism blurred into something palatable for donors and politicians. They wanted Elijah's story to become a heartwarming tale of resilience, not a scathing indictment of who gets to be brilliant in America. They wanted control of the narrative back. Alicia stood. I will not tone it down. I won't shrink this to make you comfortable. My son solved what your experts couldn't, and the moment he did, a white man wiped it away like it never existed. If that makes your job harder, you're welcome. She left the room without another word, heart pounding not from fear, but fury. That evening, reporters began showing up. Some knocked politely. Others didn't. They camped near the building entrance, pointing long lenses toward the windows of Alicia's third-floor apartment. A few shouted questions at Elijah as he walked home from the corner store with a bag of snacks. Do you want to be a mathematician? How did it feel when he erased your work? What would you say to the professor now? Elijah didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence said more than their microphones could capture. The school board released a statement by nightfall, sterile and evasive. It referred to the incident as an educational moment and expressed appreciation for diverse perspectives in academic environments. Nowhere did it mention Elijah by name. Nowhere did it acknowledge the erasure or the lie. But what it did do, quietly, behind the scenes, was escalate. The following morning, Alicia received a letter from the district's legal team. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was a courtesy reminder about media policies, implying that her interviews could misrepresent school intent and impact future community relations. It wasn't signed with a name, just a title, Compliance Director. They weren't threatening her openly. They were applying pressure the way systems always did, subtly, bureaucratically, with layers of plausible deniability. Their message was clear: stay in your place. But they had misjudged her. Alicia Monroe was not new to erasure. She had raised her son in a world that constantly asked her to apologize for his excellence, to minimize his gifts, so others could feel safe. She'd navigated school systems that gave him harder textbooks but no recognition. She'd sat through conferences where teachers whispered, "He's just too fast," as though his speed was disruptive rather than genius. And now, when the world finally saw his brilliance, they wanted her to hand it back quietly. She would not. So she went public. That night, Alicia accepted an invitation to appear on a local talk show. It wasn't national, but it had reach. She sat in front of the cameras, her voice clear, her posture straight, and told the story not just of Elijah, but of every child who had ever been silenced in classrooms built to celebrate only one kind of student. I'm not asking for charity, she said. I'm asking for the truth to matter. The clip went viral again. More networks called. More offers poured in. Some were predatory, some sincere, but in the background of that noise, something strange arrived, something she didn't expect. A plain white envelope slid under her apartment door. No stamp, no address, just her name written in sharp, blocky letters. Inside was a single USB drive and a folded note. The handwriting was jagged, rushed, but the message was unmistakable. You don't know the half of what they've done. This goes deeper than your son. Alicia stared at it, heart slamming in her chest. She looked out the peephole of her apartment door. No one. She turned the USB over in her hand, the plastic warm from her grip. Then she looked at Elijah sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by scrap paper filled with half-solved problems. And she knew, without question, that the real war had just begun. She gets a mysterious envelope containing something that could change everything. The footage didn't just go viral, it detonated. Within hours of being uploaded in its uncut form, Lila's video shattered through social media algorithms, like a lit match dropped in a dry forest. Gone were the cropped illusions and flattering edits. Now as the world saw everything, the full walk to the board, the steady unraveling of the math, the elegance of Elijah's process, and most damning of all, the deliberate unprovoked erasure, by a tenured white professor, who couldn't conceal his panic when brilliance came from a source he never expected. The silence in the video was louder than any scream. It echoed with institutional arrogance, with centuries of gatekeeping, with every moment a gifted black child was told they were disruptive for being ahead. And for once the lie didn't stick. The truth hit raw, and millions felt the sting. TikTokers broke down the math like it was a plot twist in a thriller. Twitter threads dissected every facial expression. Commentators across platforms re-uploaded the moment the professor froze. The second his smirk cracked, educational influencers who had first dismissed the event scrambled to walk back their takes. New context has come to light, they said. No apologies. Just pivot. News anchors finally caught up. A 10-year-old genius humbles Ivy League professor, the headline screamed. The equation that broke the internet. When a child became the teacher, by the next morning major networks had run the story. Not the version polished by public relations, but the raw recording. It wasn't just viral anymore. It had become a national moment, a reckoning. But not everyone was celebrating. Inside the boardrooms of academic institutions and among powerful donors whose names quietly lined the architecture of elite campuses, the conversation turned cold. Behind their doors, the story wasn't about truth. It was about containment. The school that hosted the event didn't issue a new apology. Instead, it released a sterile reaffirmation of commitment to rigorous academic discourse, sidestepping any mention of racism, erasure, or Elijah. Alesha saw it coming. She could feel the shift, the moment admiration turned into threat, the moment the world's applause became sharper, more expectant. Everyone wanted Elijah now. News shows wanted him. Think tanks wanted him. Educational programs wanted to nurture his potential, but only in ways that made them look good. Everyone wanted to say they stood beside him, as long as he didn't speak too loudly about what had been done to him. Elijah, meanwhile, was trying to stay grounded. He didn't care for the media buzz. What rattled him was the way people looked at him now, like a symbol, not a person. At school, students who had never acknowledged him before were suddenly asking for selfies. Teachers who once overlooked his raised hand were now praising him in front of class like he was a visiting celebrity. He wasn't asked how he felt. He was asked how it felt to go viral. But the most jarring shift came from the administrators. 2 days after the video hit 5 million views, Elijah was called into the principal's office. Alesha was summoned as well, though no one gave her a reason. She arrived to find Principal Hayes waiting, this time not smiling, her desk conspicuously cleared except for a printed memo. "We're placing Elijah on temporary academic leave," Hayes said flatly. Alesha's voice went sharp. "Temporary leave? For what?" Hayes folded her hands, avoiding eye contact. "We've received concerning messages. Online threats. Media inquiries that have disrupted the learning environment." Elijah blinked, confused. "I didn't do anything." "No one is saying you did," Hayes said quickly. "But in the interest of student safety, we believe it's best he steps back from in-person attendance until this moment passes." The word moment hit Alesha like a slap. "This isn't a moment," she said. "This is my son's life." But Hayes had already shifted into scripted phrases: district-wide concerns, potential liability, emergency precaution. Nothing clear, nothing honest. Just an administrative decision made to get the school out of the line of fire. They weren't protecting Elijah. They were exiling him. No timeline was given. No remote plan offered. No educational pathway suggested. Just a clean removal. Quiet, efficient. Meant to disappear him from the center of a story he had never asked to be part of. Alesha stood up. "So he's too visible now. That's the problem." Hayes didn't answer. She didn't need to. Elijah sat frozen, his small hands tightening around the straps of his backpack. He had gone to that school for 4 years. He knew every creaky hallway, every math problem scrawled on those old whiteboards. And now, because he had done what no one expected, because he had been excellent, he was being removed. He wasn't suspended. He wasn't expelled. He was just erased. Again. Alesha left with Elijah in silence, the halls echoing behind them. Outside, reporters were still camped on the sidewalk. Microphones lifted the moment they saw him. "Elijah, do you think you were treated unfairly? Do you feel safe right now?" What's your next move? Alesha stepped in front of her son and said nothing. Not yet. But that night, something inside her hardened. She opened the laptop, plugged in the mysterious USB drive she'd received the day before, and watched. Her hands trembled as she clicked the first folder. Then the second. Inside were documents. Hundreds of them. Internal memos, admissions rejections, curriculum records, names, timelines. She scrolled and stopped. One document caught her eye. It was labeled Advanced Learner Suppression Index. She opened it, and what she saw made her lean back in the chair, hand over her mouth. It wasn't just about Elijah. It was a pattern, a map. Years of academic records, showing how brilliant black students had been systematically funneled away from top-tier programs. Excuses about behavioral concerns, about teamwork skills, about emotional maturity, the same vague reasons used again and again to keep them out of the rooms where futures were built. One column read, "Intervention status disruptive to institutional balance." And there, highlighted in red, Elijah Monroe. Alesha stared at the screen, realization washing over her like ice water. They had known who he was, long before the auditorium. They had planned for what to do if he ever rose too high. Elijah is suddenly pulled from school for his safety. The discovery on the USB drive did not stay confined to Alesha's living room for long. The file names alone read like a quiet confession. Archived correspondence, case reviews, scholarship assessments, all peppered with neutral academic language that made the wrongdoing feel almost surgical. She didn't know who had sent it, but she understood the implication. The truth was never meant to surface. That night, as she stared at the spreadsheet marking Elijah's name in red, something shifted inside her. Not anger, not shock, but a cold, unwavering clarity. This wasn't a single moment of prejudice in a lecture hall. It was a pattern embedded into the machinery. By morning, journalists who had originally approached Elijah's story as a sensational headline began to look deeper. The full video had broken through the veneer. Now curiosity sharpened into investigation. One reporter from an independent outlet, Marcus Hale, reached out to Alesha with a calm voice that didn't sound like the others. He didn't ask for sound bites. He asked for time. She hesitated, then shared one document, not the whole archive, just enough to test whether he saw the same thing she did. When he read the line "intervention status disruptive to institutional balance," his silence on the call wasn't hesitation, it was recognition. Marcus had seen language like that before. He started digging. The first breadcrumb took him back 10 years to a boy named Cameron Rhodes, a math prodigy from a public magnet school, who had stunned local educators with conceptual leaps far beyond his age. Newspaper archives described him as promising, unpolished and eager, with the same soft dismissal wrapped in compliments that now echoed in Elijah's coverage. Cameron had been invited to a state academic showcase, but the article stopped there. No follow-ups, no trajectory, no story of growth. He vanished from public record, as if his brilliance evaporated overnight. Marcus found an old faculty newsletter, stored in a dusty online archive. It mentioned Cameron only once more, in a single line beneath event coverage. Student reassigned to alternative learning environment to ensure balanced group outcomes. The phrase matched almost word for word the terminology in Elijah's file. Balanced group outcomes. A polite phrase for controlled ceilings. He traced another case. A girl named Naomi Fletcher, award-winning science student, first in district rankings, pictured smiling in a lab coat beside a cardboard solar array. Her teachers described her as exceptionally advanced and highly independent. But 6 months after that ceremony, a memo appeared in the district index flagging her as socially incongruent with collaborative learning models. She too disappeared from academic competitions, transferred from accelerated tracks into general curriculum alignment. Marcus printed the records, spreading them across his dining table, until the paper looked like a mosaic of unfinished futures. The pattern sharpened, the same evaluations, the same vague behavioral language, the same silent redirection away from opportunities designed to shape leaders. Their excellence became non-compliant, their curiosity became unstructured, and always, there was a line about maintaining institutional cohesion. He called Alesha again. "This isn't new," he said quietly, his voice heavy with something that wasn't shock anymore. It was grief disguised as professionalism. "It's coordinated." She closed her eyes, breathing slowly, as his words settled into the space between them. It wasn't comfort, but it was confirmation. She wasn't imagining it. The world wasn't misunderstanding. The truth wasn't ambiguous. It was intentional. The story expanded beyond Elijah. Overnight, Comment threads filled with people recalling classmates who once excelled and then slipped away. Students who vanished from honors programs without explanation. Children spoken of as gifted in elementary school and quietly sidelined by high school. Parents wrote in messages. Former teachers sent anonymous notes, their guilt folded into each sentence. One wrote, "We were told some students advanced too fast and would destabilize peer dynamics." Another admitted, "We were encouraged to recommend alternative programs when certain students outperformed established cohorts." Certain students. No one wrote the word, but everyone understood who it applied to. Across the city, in the corner of a library basement where sunlight barely reached, Marcus interviewed a retired guidance counselor who spoke in tired, brittle sentences. "They called it academic calibration," she said, her voice trembling. "We were told the goal was equality, that keeping everyone in range prevented emotional disparities in the classroom." She paused, eyes damp. But somehow the only ones ever asked to slow down looked the same. Her words lingered like dust in the stale air. The deeper Marcus went, the more chilling the silence became around unanswered names. Some students had changed districts. Others dropped out of programs altogether. A few records ended abruptly. No forwarding school, no graduation listing. Their histories dissolved into blank spaces. He followed one such trail across 3 different files. Tracing a student whose early math scores bordered on extraordinary, Joseph Reed. At age 11, he'd been flagged for early collegiate readiness. By 14, his name vanished. No transcript transfers. No award list. No academic footprint. Only a final notation. Support pathway complete. Marcus stared at it, a knot forming in his chest. Support pathway. A phrase that sounded compassionate while burying what it destroyed. He searched social directories, government databases, alumni networks. Nothing. Joseph's name was swallowed whole by the system that once documented every percentage of his progress. Until he found him. Not in a research lab, not in a graduate database, not in an achievement archive. He found him standing outside a downtown shelter, wrapped in a thin jacket against cold wind. Marcus approached carefully, his shoes scraping lightly on rough pavement so his presence wouldn't startle. The man turned lean, older than his years, eyes sunken but still alert, still watchful, as if he'd once lived inside rooms where thinking mattered, and now measured every stranger for threat instead of conversation. Marcus introduced himself slowly, explaining why he was there, why he'd searched for a name that everyone else seemed to have misplaced. Joseph didn't respond at first. He stared into the street, watching passing cars like distant memories. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, not raspy, not broken, just quiet in a way that suggested words had long since stopped being useful. "I used to stay late in the math lab," he said. "They said I worked faster than the others, said I should be proud." His lips tightened. "Then they said I needed to adjust my pace, said I was a distraction." Marcus listened without interruption. The city noise hummed around them, indifferent. "They moved me out of competitions. Said group balance mattered more than scores. Told me I didn't collaborate well because I solved problems before they finished explaining them." He laughed, but the sound lacked humor. "Then they said I was emotionally isolated, that I should focus on life skills programs. After a while they stopped calling it gifted. They started calling it incompatible." The word hung there like a cracked bell, echoing through everything Marcus had read, everything Elijah had experienced, everything Alesha now fought against. "Incompatible with what?" Marcus asked gently. Joseph looked at him then, his eyes clearing with something that felt like recognition, not of Marcus, but of the pattern itself. "With the kind of future they'd already chosen for themselves," he murmured. Silence stretched between them, heavy and devastating. Marcus swallowed, his throat tight. "Do you remember who made those decisions?" Joseph's expression shifted, his gaze drifting toward some unreachable point in memory. Wind rattled a nearby sign. For a moment, it seemed he might turn away, might dissolve back into the anonymity the system had left him in. Instead, he leaned closer, his voice dropping into something fragile yet resolute. "They always called it support," he whispered, as if saying the word still hurt. "Said they were keeping us grounded. Said too much acceleration would separate us from our peers." His breath trembled. "But we never fell behind by accident. We were guided there." He took a step back, shoulders tightening. "It's all part of the same system." The words didn't sound bitter. They sounded tired, as if worn by repetition across years of being unheard. And in that single confession, under dim winter light outside a building, meant to house society's castaways. Marcus realized the twist wasn't that Elijah had been targeted. The twist was that Elijah was the first one who hadn't disappeared quietly. A former student, now homeless, whispers, "It's all part of the same system." It started with whispers in faculty lounges. A few questions at first, quiet, tentative, easily dismissed. But after Marcus Hale's exposé connected Elijah's story to a pattern of deliberate academic suppression, the murmurs hardened into declarations, and those declarations became fuel. Students didn't just share Elijah's footage anymore. They shared screenshots from the leaked documents, charts of intervention indexes, and video essays from peers recounting how they too had been steered away from opportunities under the same coded language. And at the center of it all, always just out of reach, but unmistakably present, was the man whose chalkboard erasure had triggered a national reckoning, Dr. Edwin Whitmore. At first the university tried to shield him. Their official statement called the incident a regrettable misunderstanding during an educational demonstration. They emphasized his decades of excellence and dedication to shaping minds across all backgrounds. But that framing unraveled within days. Journalists dug into archived student testimonials, thesis rejections, overlooked nominations. What emerged wasn't a bad moment. It was a history. A pattern of blocked letters of recommendation, subtle grading discrepancies, and award committees with unspoken quotas. Students who had once felt silenced now had proof, and they came forward. One former graduate student, Monique Langston, released an open letter describing how Whitmore had derailed her PhD candidacy after she challenged one of his published proofs. "He told me," she wrote, "there's a difference between being bright and being disruptive. You should know your place in the hierarchy of ideas." That place, she added, became clearer the moment she pushed beyond what he was comfortable seeing from someone who looked like her. Another student posted a photo of a transcript riddled with suspicious comments. "Lacks academic maturity despite potential, advances too quickly, difficult to manage, needs to align with group pace." All entries tied to black students, all tied to the same department. Within a week, a petition for Whitmore's removal gained over 150,000 signatures. Students held rallies on the steps of the administration building, holding signs that read, "Brilliance isn't a threat, and gatekeeping isn't pedagogy." Alumni rescinded donations. A group of black faculty members, long ignored in internal conversations, issued a public statement condemning the culture of suppression that had taken root under the guise of academic rigor. Yet behind the scenes, something more sinister was moving. Because Whitmore wasn't just a professor. He was an institution unto himself. His name sat atop grants, research centers, and endowed fellowships. He served on panels that decided funding for minority outreach programs, the same programs that subtly siphoned talent into under-resourced tracks. His face appeared on brochures, his signature shaped curriculum, and perhaps most damning of all, his closest allies weren't academics, they were benefactors. University donors, most of them older white men with names etched into plaques and libraries, saw the scandal not as a call for accountability, but as an attack on the sanctity of their system. One of them, a billionaire real estate mogul and longtime supporter of the university, reportedly called the president of the school and warned that pulling Whitmore would send the wrong message to other educators. The message? That they were no longer untouchable. In quiet meetings behind closed doors, crisis consultants were brought in. They offered terms like optics control, legacy protection, and strategic pivoting. A plan was floated to announce Whitmore's transition into emeritus status, spinning it as a noble retirement rather than a forced resignation. But Whitmore refused. He wouldn't step down, not out of pride, but strategy. If he left, the system would turn on him too. He needed to stay visible, needed to rewrite the ending before someone else did. So he began his counteroffensive. First came the op-eds, carefully worded, published under his name in respected journals. "We must be cautious," he wrote, "not to sacrifice intellectual rigor in our pursuit of equality." The language was calm, polished, academic, but beneath it, a warning pulsed that elevating marginalized excellence too quickly would destabilize the standards of the field. Next came the media appearances. He agreed to sit down with a prime-time interviewer, carefully selected by his PR team, who framed the controversy as a cultural misunderstanding. On air, Whitmore leaned into paternalistic charm, lamenting how a teachable moment had been distorted by media sensationalism. "The child has promise," he said, referring to Elijah, "but promise doesn't excuse premature praise. We must nurture potential, not worship it." The clip went viral for the wrong reasons. Social media exploded. Did he just call brilliance premature because it came from a black kid? One post read, "This isn't about promise. This is about control." Another tweet attached side-by-side images, one of Elijah at the board, another of Whitmore mid-sentence on live TV, with the caption, "This is the face of erasure, and this is the face of justification." But Whitmore's allies weren't retreating. A leaked memo showed that certain donors were threatening to pull funding from the university's diversity initiatives, unless a balanced narrative was restored. Behind closed doors, a group of deans floated the idea of creating a new position, a symbolic role for Elijah in some youth advisory council, a move they hoped would quiet the outrage without removing anyone from power. It was a trap dressed as inclusion. Alesha refused. "They erased my son once," she said in a now viral interview. "I won't let them use him as decoration to protect the people who tried to bury him." Elijah, meanwhile, grew quieter, not withdrawn but focused. He'd begun working through higher-level concepts on his own, sketching out the foundations of what could become original theories. But every time he looked at the news, he saw himself turned into a debate. Not a child, not a thinker, a symbol. "I'm not a trending topic," he told Alicia one night. "I just want to be allowed to learn." And still, Whitmore's circle tightened. Then came the twist. Late one evening, Marcus Hale received an anonymous file. No return address, no metadata. Inside was an audio recording. It began with static, then a voice. "Whitmore, it's not about race. It's about predictability. You let one get through like that, they all think they can rise without learning their place first. I'm not trying to erase them. I'm trying to protect the discipline from instability." Another voice responded, but it was muffled. Whitmore again. "We don't reward intuition over hierarchy." That boy solved the equation. Fine. But he skipped the ladder. "If we reward that, the whole structure collapses." The file ended. Marcus sat frozen. It was the confirmation no one expected to find. Not just bias, not just negligence. Deliberate, strategic suppression. He played it again, and again. Then he picked up his phone and dialed Alesha. By morning, the audio would reach the world. But in the darkness of a locked office somewhere on campus, Whitmore met with two men in tailored suits. They weren't professors. They weren't administrators. They were the ones who made phone calls before policies ever reached paper. "He's getting too much sympathy," one of them said. "We need to discredit the boy before this audio spreads." Whitmore didn't flinch. He poured a glass of water, his hand steady. "I think it's time we question where his solution really came from," he said calmly. "If we imply plagiarism, the public will hesitate." The other man nodded. "We'll say the method matches a previously published framework." The third leaned in, "And if that doesn't work?" Whitmore's smile returned. "Then we remind them, gifted doesn't mean exempt, especially not when it threatens legacy." But Dr. Whitmore has powerful friends, and they're planning their next move. The invitation arrived on crisp embossed stationery that smelled faintly of fresh ink and old money, the kind of letter that never touched public school mailboxes. It bore the seal of the Northeast Mathematics Consortium, an elite symposium where leading minds gathered once a year to present revolutionary work in the purest forms of logic, theory, and proof. Elijah's name was printed in bold, followed by the words, "Guest Demonstrator, Youth Genius Track." It was a headline in disguise. The organizers didn't see him as a contributor. They saw him as a novelty, a media moment, a viral mind to parade for optics and applause. But Elijah didn't care about that. Not yet. What gripped him was the chance to share his thinking aloud, uncut, in front of people who lived and breathed mathematics, even if they didn't expect to be outshined by a child. Alesha had hesitated. The last time Elijah had stood before an elite crowd, his work had been erased in real time. The memory of that marker slashing through his proof still haunted them both in quiet flashes, sudden pauses, long stares, the quiet what-if that always followed when the noise faded. But this time, something was different. Elijah had grown quieter, yes, but also sharper. He'd stopped trying to fit the rhythms of those around him. He worked when he haunted, slept irregularly, scribbled equations on napkins, mirrors, and corners of cereal boxes. It wasn't just intelligence anymore. It was control. The night before the symposium, Elijah stayed up drafting his demonstration, not a repeat of what had already gone viral, but a new approach to abstract dimensional modeling that had startled even Marcus when he read the outline. "You're writing like a postgraduate," Marcus said softly. "They're not ready for you." Elijah didn't smile. "I'm not writing for them to be ready. I'm writing so they can't say they didn't see it. The auditorium hosting the symposium was a grand old hall on the edge of an Ivy League campus, where history clung to every brick and ambition echoed off stained glass windows. The crowd that filed in that morning was dressed in layers of quiet power, suede elbow patches, custom tailoring, decades of expectation. There were professors, researchers, private tech donors, journalists, and a carefully selected audience of students deemed academically mature enough to attend. Backstage, Elijah waited in a quiet room set aside for presenters. The organizers had kept him separate from the adult mathematicians, for his comfort, they claimed. But the true purpose was clear: insulation. He wasn't meant to mingle with the establishment. He was meant to be shown and shelved. A conference volunteer entered, a young man with a headset and a practiced smile. "Your slide deck has been uploaded to the system," he said. "We'll cue it from the control booth. Just stick to your time slot, 10 minutes max." Elijah nodded silently, clutching a USB drive in his hand. The original file, just in case. Meanwhile, two symposium planners huddled in a side office, watching a live monitor feed. "He's going to run through the modeling example, isn't he?" one whispered. The other, an older woman with steel gray hair and decades in academia, replied calmly, "It's already being handled."
What do you mean?
She turned to her assistant. "The system is being restructured. Slight delay loading his file. Maybe a corrupted video. These things happen." The implications settled between them like dust. It wasn't sabotage in the loud, obvious sense. It was quiet, procedural, deniable, a glitch in the system, a minor oversight, a technical issue that would reduce Elijah's moment to stammered confusion and public failure. They wouldn't erase his work this time. They would let him present, but make sure it didn't work. And by the time he was done, he'd look like a child out of his depth. The crowd began to settle as the MC announced, "Our next presenter is one whose name you may already know. A prodigious young thinker. Please welcome Elijah Monroe." Polite applause, controlled curiosity, a few raised eyebrows. Elijah stepped onto the stage slowly, backpack slung over one shoulder, his small figure dwarfed by the towering projection screen behind him. He didn't carry a speech, just the USB drive and the math in his mind. He looked out into the sea of neutral faces, trying not to think of Whitmore's voice, of the board being wiped clean, of the men in suits plotting behind university walls. He thought instead of Joseph, the homeless former genius, and the whisper that still echoed in his ears, "It's all part of the same system." He reached the podium, took a breath, and inserted the USB drive into the port. Nothing happened. He clicked again. Still nothing. The screen behind him remained blank, not even a cursor, just a frozen system screen. The technician backstage panicked, whispering into his headset, "His file won't load. System just kicked it." Something about corruption. Elijah's fingers hovered over the keyboard. The machine made a faint whir, then shut itself off completely. The moderator cleared her throat. "It seems we're having a small technical issue. Perhaps you can begin your explanation verbally, Elijah, while we address the display." A few chuckles rippled through the audience. Not cruel, but skeptical. Elijah stood still, heart pounding. He looked down at his drive, then back at the unblinking sea of eyes. Some were already judging, others waiting to see if the boy genius would crumble live. He glanced to the side of the stage, where a thin, anxious volunteer waved helplessly. And then, from the second row, a hand went up, slow, deliberate, unexpected. It was Lila. She was dressed in simple jeans and a navy coat, seated among invite-only guests because Marcus had insisted she come. Her voice rose across the auditorium. "Elijah, use mine." She held up her laptop. "Already open." A murmur spread. The moderator stammered, "I'm sorry, outside tech," but Marcus, seated a few rows behind, rose to his feet. "Let the boy present." A second later, another voice from the crowd echoed, "Let him show us." Applause followed, spontaneous, rising. Someone handed Lila's laptop forward. Elijah plugged in the drive again. A different file, the backup, and this time, the model loaded instantly. The screen lit up with colors, vectors, multidimensional projections, rotating in smooth fluidity. He didn't speak with excitement. He spoke with precision, calm, control. And then for 10 minutes, he walked the audience through a theoretical structure that challenged the foundational approach to dimensional probability. A method that offered alternate proof strategies even advanced mathematicians had yet to explore. The room fell utterly silent. He didn't rush. He didn't seek praise. He just built, layer by layer, a new way of seeing. And when he finished, he looked directly at the moderator and said, "This was never about permission. It's about recognition." The applause this time wasn't polite. It was thunderous. But just as Elijah stepped down, a figure slipped quietly into a side door backstage, a man in a gray suit, holding a tablet. He approached one of the symposium organizers, whispered in her ear, and handed over the screen. Her eyes widened. There, on the screen, was a flagged notice, a complaint filed against Elijah, alleging unauthorized access to protected material, an unverified source derivation in his modeling technique. The name on the complaint, Dr. Edwin Whitmore. Just before his presentation, someone sabotages his computer. The echoes of applause from the symposium still lingered in Elijah's ears, long after the hall had emptied, not as triumph, but as a strange hollow resonance, a sound that felt too large for his small shoulders. He walked out of the building beside Alessia and Marcus in a quiet procession lit by the pale afternoon sun, the crowd around them parting in slow waves. Some people smiled at him, some nodded respectfully, and others simply stared, the kind of stare that measured, not admired. The standing ovation had not erased the truth about the room. It had only exposed it more clearly. Elijah had risen, and instead of celebrating that rise, the institution had immediately filed paperwork to question it. Alessia had seen the look on the symposium director's face when the complaint notification appeared on her tablet, the tightness around her mouth, the sudden shift from awe to calculation. She had leaned down to Elijah and whispered, "We're going home now." Not in fear, in preparation. Back in their small apartment, the world outside buzzed with conversations about his presentation. But inside, the silence returned, heavy, watchful. Elijah sat at the table, pencil hovering above a blank page. His thoughts moved quickly, yet his hand was he kept replaying the moment his computer froze, the split-second drop in the room's energy, the subtle relief on certain faces when they thought the presentation would collapse. "It wasn't an accident," Elijah murmured. Alessia turned from the sink. "What?" He didn't lift his eyes. "The computer. It didn't glitch. It was done on purpose." Marcus didn't argue. He nodded slowly, his voice low. "Someone didn't want you to be understood." The truth had a sound. It didn't come crashing in. It settled. That night, Marcus forwarded Alessia a copy of Whitmore's formal complaint. The language was crisp, the tone intellectual, but between every line lived something far uglier. The insinuation that Elijah's work could not possibly be original. It suggested unverified derivation sources, likely adaptation and conceptual mimicry beyond developmental expectation. Not once did it accuse him directly. It didn't have to. The subtext carried the accusation for him. Whitmore didn't call Elijah brilliant. He called him implausible. The following morning, Elijah's school requested a meeting. Again, but this time, it wasn't with Principal Hayes alone. Waiting in the conference room was someone Elijah trusted, someone who had once believed in him. Mr. Bennett. He was one of the few teachers who had ever encouraged Elijah to think beyond textbooks. The man who used to slide extra worksheets toward him with quiet pride, who once told Alessia, "Your son isn't ahead, the system is behind him." Elijah had lit up in his class because Mr. Bennett never tried to slow him down. Now he sat across the table, hands folded, face too calm. "Elijah," he said softly, "we're worried about you." The words felt wrong. Alessia leaned forward. "Worried? How?" Mr. Bennett hesitated. The kind of hesitation that didn't come from confusion, but guilt. "There's discussion among academic coordinators. They're concerned that the work Elijah is producing may not be entirely his." Silence. Elijah's breath stilled. Alessia's expression sharpened. "I've seen his notebooks," she said slowly. "Every line. Every late night." "What are you saying?" Bennett avoided Elijah's eyes. "I've been asked to share some of Elijah's early assignments," he continued. "They want to match patterns in his writing style, compare it to the symposium material." Marcus' voice echoed in Alessia's head. "They don't believe he belongs at that level. They don't believe he can exist." Alessia's tone cooled, every word deliberate. "And did you share them?" Bennett swallowed. "Yes." The room tightened. He didn't speak defensively. He spoke like someone who had convinced himself his betrayal was reasonable, even necessary. "They told me this would protect him," he said. "They said that if we verified his progress, the academic board would advocate for his advancement. The people reviewing his work, they're powerful. If they approve him, doors will open." Elijah stared at him, not with anger, with a dawning awareness that felt like gravity shifting beneath his feet. "You gave them my work without asking me." Elijah said quietly. His voice didn't rise. It didn't tremble. It sank. Then its gaze flickered, haunted. Elijah, I didn't want them to think you were a anomaly. I wanted them to see proof that you've always been this way. Alesha stood. Don't make this sound like protection, she said. You didn't stand up for him. You handed him over. Mr. Bennett took a breath that sounded like defeat. You don't understand the system, he murmured. No, Alesha replied. I understand it too well. When they left the building, the air outside felt colder than before. Not because of weather but because something sacred had fractured. Trust. Safety. The last illusion that at least one person inside the system had been on Elijah's side. They walked in silence, the city noise fading into a dull hum. Elijah finally spoke. He was helping them, he said. All this time, Alesha didn't correct him. She couldn't, because the truth wasn't that Mr. Bennett had always been the enemy. The truth was worse. He had been groomed by the system too. That afternoon, Marcus called in a low, urgent voice. We just received a leak, he said. Internal emails. Faculty correspondence. Bennett wasn't acting alone. Alesha braced herself. What did they say? Marcus sighed. They referred to him as a cooperative internal observer. They've been using him to track Elijah's academic growth for over a year, forwarding his work for quiet evaluation, without your consent. Elijah sat still at the kitchen table, absorbing every word like cold wind. He had been studied, not nurtured, monitored, measured, prepared for containment. Alesha closed her eyes, resisting the urge to scream, not because she was afraid of breaking, but because screaming would acknowledge how deeply the knife had been planted. They're building a case, Marcus continued. A narrative that says Elijah's intelligence surged too suddenly, that the symposium work couldn't have developed naturally at his age without external influence. Alesha's voice sharpened. They want to make him look like a thief. Marcus didn't respond. He didn't have to. By nightfall, articles began appearing in small academic circles. Anonymous think pieces questioning youthful precocity in competitive spaces, threads implying the danger of placing unverified talent into advanced environments too quickly. None mentioned Elijah by name, but the shadow he cast in their phrasing was unmistakable. He wasn't being erased this time. He was being discredited, piece by piece, word by word. That evening Elijah sat cross-legged on his bedroom floor, surrounded by scrap papers filled with ideas that stretched beyond standard classification. He didn't cry. He didn't panic. He just stared at the doorway. Alesha, he asked softly, why do they want my work to belong to someone else? She knelt beside him, her voice heavy with truth she could no longer soften. Because if they admit it belongs to you, she said, they have to admit the world is lying about who is allowed to be extraordinary. Silence filled the room, not empty, but alive with something dangerous. New understanding. Later that night, as rain tapped softly against the window, Elijah's phone buzzed on the floor beside him. He picked it up. A text appeared from an unknown number. No name, no image, just 5 words. Cold, terrifying, purposeful. They know where you live. The text sat on Elijah's screen, glowing against the darkened room, like an open wound. They know where you live. No name, no number, no reply. He stared at it, frozen, not with fear but with the weight of confirmation. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't imagination. It wasn't just academic sabotage anymore. It had breached the walls of theory and crossed into threat, into something real, something calculated. And worse, it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about where he slept, where he dreamed, where his mother cooked dinner and kept the lights on late, so he could study. He didn't tell Alesha right away. Not because he wanted to hide it, but because she already carried too much, and he couldn't bring himself to add this yet. So he deleted the message but couldn't delete the knowing. The hum in his chest that something invisible had begun circling them. The first sign came 3 mornings later. Their car, an old blue sedan, parked just beneath their 3rd-story apartment window, was found with all 4 tires slashed. The windshield bore a single word, scratched into the glass with something sharp: stay small. The police came slowly, casually. One officer, barely out of academy age, glanced at the damage and shrugged. Looks like a couple of kids messing around, he said. We've seen it before. Alesha's mouth tightened. Kids don't write stay small in perfectly spaced block letters. The officer didn't take a statement. He didn't even file a report until she demanded a copy. When she insisted they check neighborhood cameras, the second officer sighed. We'll look into it. Probably just a prank. Prank. The word clanged. Like Elijah's rising brilliance was a punchline now. The second sign came in their mailbox. 5 letters over the course of a week, each in different handwriting, different envelopes, but always unsigned. Inside, threats. Not dramatic, not movie scripted, just simple lines, each more chilling than the last. They don't protect your kind forever. Erase the boy, or we will. No more math. No more martyr. Marcus took pictures of each one, logged the postmarks, and reached out to the local press. Only one outlet responded. A small digital news blog that covered community issues. The rest stayed silent. The story didn't fit the polished narrative anymore. Elijah wasn't just a child genius breaking barriers. He was now a disruption that made the right people uneasy. Alessia began checking windows before bed. Not just locking them, checking them, twice, sometimes 3 times. She stopped letting Elijah walk alone, even to the store around the corner. She changed their route to school. She changed their groceries to digital delivery. The apartment, once cramped but safe, now felt like a glass box waiting to be shattered. But what they couldn't change was visibility. Elijah's name had gone too far. After the symposium, offers had poured in. Fellowships, speaking engagements, curated podcasts, all promising recognition, resources, guidance. Alessia declined most of them. Some were legitimate. Many felt like extraction. People trying to claim his story before it was finished. Corporations trying to fold him into their image of progress. They wanted to say they'd helped Elijah, not admit they'd ignored what had happened to him. And still, the threats escalated. One night, while they slept, someone spray-painted a red X on the hallway wall, outside their door. Another night, a brick was thrown against their front window. It didn't shatter the glass, but it left a mark, a spiderweb of cracks, that glimmered every morning, like a warning left behind. Police continued calling them isolated incidents. When Alessia demanded a neighborhood patrol, she was told there weren't enough resources. We have real emergencies to handle, the officer said. And that was the moment she realized, in their eyes, this wasn't an emergency. Because in their eyes, her son wasn't in danger. He was the danger, a quiet one, an unspoken one, a child who had violated the unspoken rule. Know your place. That weekend, Elijah stayed home. No outings, no events, no press. He worked silently on his proofs, sketching the outline of something new, something abstract, a system of convergence that he couldn't yet explain in words, only in motion. Alessia watched him, heart torn between awe and anxiety. His mind was untouched, but his world was closing in. Then came the firebomb. It wasn't a full explosion. It was a bottle, thrown from a moving car at 2:17. It hit the wall just below their window, not close enough to set the building on fire, but enough to scorch the concrete and send smoke curling into the air. Enough to leave behind shards of glass and the scent of gasoline. Enough to send a message. We know where to aim. Alessia woke in a panic, racing to Elijah's room, only to find him already standing, fully awake, his eyes locked on the window as if he'd felt it coming. She called the police. This time, they showed up faster, but they still didn't stay long. Looks like a random act, one officer said. Probably not targeted. He said it while standing next to the graffiti from the previous night. When Marcus arrived 10 minutes later, he took one look at the scene and said, "We need to move him. Now." But move him where? Elijah's face was already on every screen. His story had already become the property of 1,000 think pieces. Wherever he went, they would follow, not because of who he was, but because of what he represented. A mind that couldn't be controlled. A narrative that couldn't be buried. Alessia looked at her son. "Do you want to leave?" she asked, softly, already knowing the answer. Elijah shook his head. "No, I want them to." But that night, something changed. He didn't sleep in his bed. He moved to the floor of Alessia's room, with a blanket, and his notebook. And though neither of them said it aloud, they both knew sleep would be a stranger for a while. The next day was supposed to be normal. As normal as possible. Elijah packed his bag like usual. He walked out the door with Alessia watching from the window. She made coffee, sat down, watched the clock. 9:15. Still no word. She checked her phone. No messages. By 11:00, she called the school. They told her he hadn't arrived. Her voice dropped into the kind of silence that comes right before panic. "Check again," she said. "We did," the secretary replied. He never checked in. Alessia dropped the phone, ran. Outside, his usual path was empty. She checked the store, the park, the library, the street cameras. She called Marcus. She called the police. Again. And this time there was no laughter. No dismissal. Because this time a child had vanished. And this time, there was history to prove it wasn't random. One night, Elijah doesn't come home. By sunrise, the Monroe apartment was no longer a home. It was a angered post of grief, fear, and unspoken fury. Alicia stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by officers who moved through her space, like it was an inconvenience. Every step they took was louder than necessary. Every question colder than the last. They asked what time Elijah left, what he was wearing, whether he had a history of running off. One officer even asked if there had been any recent arguments in the household. It was all theater, the kind designed to buy time, to redirect blame, to soften their own negligence by implying fault within the family. Alicia didn't cry. She didn't scream. She answered each question like a blade, her voice slicing through every insinuation with precision. "My son didn't run," she said. "He was taken." The lead detective, a man with thinning hair and the bored demeanor of someone who had seen too much but learned too little, gave a tight-lipped nod. "We're looking into all possibilities." "You mean now?" she snapped. "After weeks of threats, vandalism, firebombs. After I reported everything and got told it was probably just kids being kids. Now that he's missing, you're suddenly looking into it." He didn't answer, because there was no answer. The media caught wind of Elijah's disappearance by mid-morning. Not because of a police bulletin, but because Marcus Hale broke the story. He published an exposé, with the headline in bold, furious font, "Missing Genius. System knew, did nothing." The piece recounted every warning sign, the vandalized car, the threatening letters, the firebomb, the ignored reports. It included quotes from Alicia, from Lila, from students who had witnessed the institutional negligence unfold in real time. It went viral in hours. And this time, the internet didn't just react. It erupted. Commenters didn't ask, "What if he's hiding?" They asked, "Why didn't they protect him?" Hashtags flooded timelines. "Where is Elijah? Erased by the system. Black brilliance stolen." Protesters gathered outside Elijah's school and the local police precinct. Celebrities posted his photo. Civil rights attorneys called for federal intervention. For once, the question wasn't whether racism was involved. It was how deep it went. Cable news couldn't ignore it anymore. By evening, national anchors were leading with Elijah's story. News packages showed clips of him presenting at the symposium, overlaid with headlines like, "Prodigy disappears amid growing threats." Panels debated the role of law enforcement, the failure of schools, and the legacy of white institutions that crushed black excellence the moment it refused to play by their rules. And underneath it all was the one question no one could answer. Where was Elijah? Alicia stood in front of a bank of reporters outside her building, cameras flashing, microphones crowding her face. "My son isn't just missing," she said. "He was made a target. And every institution that saw this coming and did nothing is responsible. This isn't just my loss. This is a national shame." She didn't flinch. Her voice didn't waver. And yet inside she was unraveling. Each hour without a lead felt like another step away from the possibility of finding him alive. She replayed every detail from that morning. The way he'd tied his shoes slower than usual. The half-smile he'd given her before closing the door. Had he known? Had he sensed? She'd checked his notebook again. His latest equation unfinished. Mid-thought. That terrified her more than anything. Elijah never left a thought incomplete. By day 2, the FBI joined the search. The pressure had grown too large for local law enforcement to manage alone. Agents combed through Elijah's laptop, his school records, traffic camera data. The apartment was scanned for fingerprints, for digital traces of the text message he'd received. Nothing concrete. Then, late that night, Lila knocked on Marcus's office door holding a flash drive. "I think this is something," she said, her voice shaking. "It was on the school's internal drive. I used to help with IT maintenance. I kept my login." Marcus opened the footage. It was grainy, black and white, captured from a traffic camera 2 blocks from Elijah's school. The timestamp was clear, 8:07 a.m. The exact window of time Elijah should have been arriving. The clip showed a dark van parked across the street. Nothing remarkable at first glance. Then a figure approached, small, slight. Elijah. He stood there for a second, clearly confused. The side door opened. Another figure stepped out. Not forceful. Not rushed. Fur. They said something, you couldn't hear it. But the body language was deliberate. Elijah hesitated, then moved closer. And then, the van door slid shut. The van pulled away, gone in less than 30 seconds. Marcus paused the footage, breath stuck in his throat. There on the jacket of the person who'd coaxed Elijah in was a small glinting badge, barely visible, but just clear enough to make out the seal, the university's crest. Alicia watched the footage on Marcus's laptop in stunned silence. Her hand slowly rose to cover her mouth as the realization set in. This wasn't some random abduction. This wasn't a hate crime from a stranger. This was internal, deliberate, institutional. They took him, she whispered. They actually took him. Marcus stood slowly, fists clenched. They didn't want him dead. They wanted him controlled, silenced before he could finish what he started. The implications were too large, too terrifying. Somewhere within the university, or those tied to its network, someone had authorized this. Someone had sent that van. Someone had made the decision to remove a child for being too brilliant, too black, too loud in a space designed to contain and redirect him. Marcus called a contact in federal investigative media. The footage was verified and released within the hour, and now the public fury evolved into something else. Outrage mixed with disbelief. The most elite academic institution in the country was now being accused not of oversight, but abduction. Within hours, students walked out of classes across campuses. Protesters surrounded the university gates, holding signs that read, "He solved it, so you stole him. And this isn't academia. This is kidnapping." Senators tweeted, lawyers mobilized, and somewhere behind polished boardroom doors, people in suits scrambled to rewrite their steps. But Alicia wasn't waiting for apology. She was already packing. She didn't know where Elijah was yet, but now she knew who had him, and she wasn't going to wait another second to bring her son home. A grainy security video shows Elijah being pulled into a van by someone wearing a university badge. The university's public statement arrived 2 hours after the security footage went live. It was polished to the point of sterility, a masterclass in deflection disguised as professionalism. In it, the administration expressed deep concern over Elijah's disappearance while denying any involvement. They called the crest on the jacket unclear, the footage inconclusive, and the allegations troubling but premature. Nowhere in the statement did they name Elijah. Nowhere did they explain why their own internal servers had mysteriously been scrubbed of footage from other angles near the van. In nowhere, not even in the footnotes, did they acknowledge their direct relationship with Dr. Edwin Whitmore, who had disappeared from campus just 24 hours prior. But the country was no longer in a mood for careful language. The video was being played on every major network in slow motion. The frame of Elijah approaching the van had become a symbol, not just of one child's abduction, but of centuries of stolen potential. Protesters now surrounded Ivy League gates and suburban school districts alike, demanding answers. Congressmen called for hearings. International media ran with the headline, "Child Prodigy Disappears in American Academic Scandal." And through it all, Alicia stood like steel, speaking with the fury of a mother and the clarity of a woman who had been gaslit by institutions her entire life. But what she hadn't yet seen, what no one outside of one encrypted server had, was the document that explained why. It was buried deep in a secure folder titled Legacy Management. Alicia had stumbled upon it not through Elijah's files, but from an anonymous whistleblower within the university who'd reached out through a burner email address. The subject line read, "You deserve to see this before they erase it." The file's name stopped her heart cold. Elijah Protocol. Terminate advancement. It wasn't a metaphor, it was a plan. The document was over 30 pages long. It contained flowcharts, evaluation matrices, and coded language that made her stomach turn. At first glance, it read like a performance monitoring system, standard educational lingo. But the deeper she read, the more sinister it became. There were levels: observe, redirect, stall, and finally, terminate advancement. Each level was attached to specific criteria, not related to performance, but to disruption. And what they defined as disruption was chillingly specific: non-linear intellect demonstrated by individuals outside of traditional feeder institutions, unorthodox methods, developed without institutional supervision, and most disturbingly, minority identification paired with public visibility. Elijah had triggered every red flag in their algorithm. He wasn't just a student they failed to support. He was flagged as a threat to their academic hierarchy. Terminate advancement meant exactly what it sounded like: erase opportunity, suppress visibility, remove mobility, all cloaked under developmental redirection. The document even referenced prior case studies, not by name, but by initials and performance traits. Alicia cross-checked the dates and skills. They matched the very students Marcus had uncovered: the boy who had vanished into homelessness, the girl who was removed from STEM tracks, the names that had fallen into bureaucratic black holes. They had done this before, they were doing it still. And Elijah wasn't an accident. He was an escalation. Alessia sent the document to Marcus. Within an hour he was at her door. Eyes red, jaw tight. They built a whole infrastructure for this, he said. This isn't just prejudice. It's policy. They spent the night parsing every line of the Elijah protocol. Hidden within the jargon was something even more disturbing. Financial backers. Each phase was connected to donor tiers. Each donor was informed quietly, through closed boardroom briefings, of which non-legacy anomalies had reached alert status. It was part of how prestige was preserved, not through competition, but through quiet elimination. One name stood out among the donors: Whitmore Endowment Circle. It wasn't just Dr. Whitmore's ideology fueling the machine. It was his money. The next morning, Alessia walked into the newsroom of a major broadcast station, with the document in a flash drive around her neck. She demanded a live interview. No delays. No pre-taped edit sessions. She told them, "You air this, or I walk across the street to someone who will." 10 minutes later, she was sitting under studio lights, facing a national audience. She didn't read from a script. She read from her gut. "My son is not missing," she said. "He was targeted. The system that claims to educate brilliance built a protocol to suppress it, especially when it shows up in black skin without their stamp of approval. They tracked him. They flagged him. And now they've taken him." The host stared at her, stunned. "Are you saying this was an orchestrated removal?" "I'm not saying it," Alessia replied. "I'm proving it." She held up the flash drive. The next morning, every headline changed. The Elijah Protocol. Academic racism as policy. Terminate advancement. Leaked document exposes anti-black intelligence suppression. The university issued a second statement. This one stammering, reactive. They claimed the document was unauthorized, the work of a rogue faction, an isolated theoretical framework never adopted by the institution. But that lie unraveled in real time, because Marcus found more. The next leak came from inside the donor network. Anonymous transcripts of meetings where trustees discussed the integrity threat posed by rapid advancing non-affiliated students. A phrase that now stood at the center of lawsuits, rallies, and international condemnation. But the biggest twist arrived when the FBI task force, now under public pressure to act swiftly, tracked the GPS logs of a university-owned research vehicle, a black van, matching the one from the footage. It had made an unscheduled trip, not to a remote lab, but to a private off-campus educational facility, registered under a non-profit shell. Its listed purpose: gifted child behavioral integration. Its founder? A retired academic ethics advisor who had once served on Whitmore's personal committee. The building was gated. No logo, no website. And according to federal records, it had received a large grant just weeks before Elijah's disappearance. Alessia didn't wait for a warrant. She drove straight there. But by the time she arrived, the gates were open. The building empty. Files shredded. Security systems wiped. And inside, in the center of a dark room lined with observation glass and child-sized desks, was a single item left behind. Elijah's notebook. His name on the cover. A page torn at the back. Its last line written in his tiny, steady hand. "They're trying to rewire me." Alessia held the notebook to her chest, her tears silent. He was alive. Somewhere he was still writing, still thinking, still resisting. But the next steps would be harder, because if they were willing to build a system to suppress one child, what else had they built to keep him hidden? The files include a disturbing document labeled Elijah Protocol Terminate Advancement. The national spotlight hit the downtown courthouse with the weight of an eclipse. Press cameras stationed like artillery, satellite vans humming with static energy, and crowds that had swelled into human tides outside the sealed doors. Inside, the marbled floors reflected a constellation of tension. Lawyers in tailored suits moving like white-gloved chess pieces, aides whispering into Bluetooth earpieces, and jurors whose eyes had already absorbed hours of damning evidence before this day even began. But it was the gallery that carried the real gravity. Familiar faces from rallies, former students who had come forward, journalists who had chased every leak, and families holding signs that read, "Black brilliance shouldn't have to disappear." Behind all of them, deep inside, was a single truth, unspoken yet unmistakable. This was no longer just a case. It was America's mirror. The gallery hushed to a near-sacred silence as Alicia Monroe entered. Not escorted, not protected, but walking with the calm storm of someone whose life had already been dismantled and refused to be quiet. Her eyes were rimmed with fatigue, But there was a fire there that not even months of institutional lies could extinguish. Every step she took was deliberate, measured, like a heartbeat marking time. The courtroom cameras zoomed in, capturing her presence with the reverence of both doubt and disbelief. Here was the mother whose son had been erased from school rolls, whose name had been smeared by academic rumor mills, whose living child was alleged lost by institutions that should have protected him. The prosecutor rose first, a woman in her late 40s named Cassandra Brooks, whose voice was both steel and balm, the kind of speaker who could make heated reality feel ordered and inevitable. She began by laying out the severity of the charges: unlawful detention, institutional conspiracy, falsification of records, and reckless endangerment. But beneath the legal language was something larger, something the nation had been aching to hear: that a child's disappearance was not an accident, a misunderstanding, or a regrettable outlier, but a consequence of entrenched systems that had weaponized privilege and prejudice to protect themselves. As the evidence will show, Brooks asserted, eyes sweeping the jury like a predator smelling certainty, this institution, long regarded as a bastion of academic excellence, engaged in a coordinated suppression of youth achievement, when that achievement threatened its legacy and social hierarchy. We are not here merely to assign blame. We are here to reclaim truth. Gasps, not from shock at the words, but at the taste of truth finally spoken aloud. Then the defense stood, a man named Derek Lang, polished and unflappable, whose role was less to refute facts than to recast them. He spoke of academic protocols, protective behavioral curricula, and institutional integrity, phrases so sterile they felt designed to disinfect racism itself. His tone was measured, his gaze calm, but there was an edge to it, the paradoxical message that every word could be both truth and concealment. To the defense, Elijah's disappearance was not a crime, it was a procedural anomaly, a series of unfortunate events magnified by public sentiment and media distortion. They portrayed the university's actions as miscommunication, not malice, as protective oversight, not suppression. In doing so, they weaponized language the same way they had once erased Elijah's proof. Alesha sat perfectly still as Lang spoke, jaw set like iron. She could hear the courtroom breathing, like collective lungs inhaling and exhaling tension, while waiting for the pivot, the moment when the story snapped from abstract argument to the beating heart of reality. It came when Cassandra Brooks called her first witness, Lila Pierce. Lila's arrival was met with a ripple of applause from the gallery, the kind that startled the courtroom into immediate focus. She walked with a poise that defied her age, no longer the shy sophomore who recorded class footage, but a young woman whose actions had ignited the world's conscience. Her testimony was calm but fierce, anchored in facts so precise they felt like truth's own heartbeat. "I was in the auditorium that day," she said simply. "I recorded the full video because I knew something important was happening. And when the edited clip went viral, it was wrong. It was a lie. I saw the entire solution. I saw his proof completed, and I saw Professor erase it." The defense attempted to discredit her. Questions about perspective, video framing, bias, memory, but Lila responded with clarity that dissolved every insinuation. "You can question why I recorded. You can question what I saw, but the uncut footage exists, and I released it, because fear should never be the curator of truth." The courtroom erupted, whispers, gasps, heads turning, networks buzzing, but Alesha barely registered anything beyond Lila's quiet strength. She saw only the confirmation that her instincts had never lied. There were people left in the world brave enough to stand for what was right. Next came the whistleblower who had sent the Elijah Protocol document, Dr. Miriam Tate, a tenured faculty member whose hands trembled as she took the stand, but whose voice did not. She detailed internal emails, coded instructions, and departmental memos directing behavior tracking, diversion of talent, and suppression of non-legacy anomalies, her words peeling back the veil of euphemism that had shielded racism behind academic rhetoric. The defense attempted to frame everything as misunderstanding, a division of opinion, a disagreement over best practices, but no amount of institutional vocabulary could soften the image of protocol steps labeled "terminate advancement," with crossed-out names of children reduced to red flags, initials, catalog codes. The prosecutor presented each document slowly, as if the courtroom needed time to absorb how deep the intent had been, not just to erase Elijah's proof, but to erase the possibility of others like him ever rising without permission. And then, the twist. Just as the questioning paused and murmurs rippled through the gallery, the courtroom doors slammed open. People turned. Judges paused. Spectators leaned forward, Because through the doors walked someone no one expected to see. A thin boy, limp in posture, eyes shadowed with depth no 10-year-old should ever carry, walking with a shuffle that betrayed months of confinement and silence. Gasps thundered through the room, a sound that felt like a rupture in the atmosphere. The boy's eyes scanned the courtroom, slow and deliberate, as if he was waking from a long fog, and noticing every face as though they were shapes in a strange dream. His clothes were simple, no media branding, no logos, no staged outfits, just a sweater that hung loosely and pants slightly worn at the knees. And then the courtroom recognized him. Elijah. A collective breath broke. Some people cried. Others gasped. Several stood abruptly. And Alesha? She did not run. She did not shout. She simply stared, as though the universe had folded in on itself. Because in that moment, everything she had fought for, everything she had lost, everything she had screamed into silence, was standing in the courtroom alive. But the Elijah who walked through the doors was not the same boy who had once stood before a whiteboard, marker in hand, brilliance in his gaze. This Elijah walked slowly, his eyes scanning the room with a haunted depth, as though he had seen too much, felt too much, and learned something no child should ever have to learn. His voice, when it came, quiet, calm, and layered with the kind of weight that had nothing to do with age, froze the room. "I'm here," he said. But the way he said it was not triumphant. It was calculated, measured, unsettling. Like someone who had learned that survival did not require faith. It required adaptation. It required secrecy. It required something quietly terrifying. The judge leaned forward, eyes locked on Elijah, as the room swelled in a mix of relief and confusion. And then, just as Cassandra Brooks rose to ask him the first question, Elijah looked directly at the defense table, where one man sat perfectly still, jaw tightened, face a mask of rage and fear that dissolved into something unmasked and raw. Dr. Edwin Whitmore. He had returned, unannounced, unrestrained, and as the courtroom erupted, voices overlapping, cameras zooming, hearts pounding, Elijah stood still, breathing slowly, as though the next word he spoke would shift the fate of every person in that room. And then, with a voice soft enough to contradict the chaos around him, he said something no one expected. "They think I'm here to testify, but I came to reveal them." The cameras did not stop clicking the moment Elijah walked into the courthouse. They simply changed focus. What had once been a national story about a missing child, a 10-year-old genius erased by a prestigious institution, was now something else entirely. It had become a reckoning. Every angle of his thin frame, every twitch of his jaw, every second his eyes refused to blink under the harsh overhead lights became a subject of analysis, dissection, and fascination. He wasn't just a survivor now. He was a symbol not of resilience but of all the brilliance that had ever been buried beneath polite racism, denied entrance into rooms disguised as meritocracies, and reduced to footnotes in reports titled achievement gaps. He didn't sit in the witness box like a victim. He didn't cry. He didn't perform gratitude. Elijah simply placed the worn notebook, the one they had recovered from the facility, on the desk in front of him, opened to the torn page and looked up. No script, no lawyers whispering in his ear, just silence so thick, it seemed to recalibrate the atmosphere. "I didn't want to come back," he said flatly. No theatrics, no softening. His voice sounded older than it should have, stretched by days spent in isolation, by whispered experiments masked as enrichment, by walls that taught him a new kind of silence. Not the absence of sound, but the suppression of self. "But I realized if I didn't come back, they'd keep telling the story without me." He turned to the judge, to the jury, to the sea of unfamiliar faces pretending they hadn't already made up their minds. "I solved the equation. You all saw it. And they still erased it. That should have been the end." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. But he didn't stop. "They put me in a place with other kids. We weren't allowed to talk much. They said it was to help us focus. But I saw what they were really doing. They weren't trying to teach us. They were trying to reprogram us, make us stop asking questions, make us solve problems the way they wanted." He didn't have to name names. He didn't have to prove he'd been hurt. His existence alive, unbroken, defiant, was the only proof needed that something cruel and systemic had tried to unmake him and failed. From that point forward, no one in the courtroom heard the judge's instructions. No one paid attention to procedural pauses or legal motions. They only watched Elijah, the boy who had forced an entire nation to confront its oldest, most polite form of erasure. In the days following his return, the floodgates opened. Institutions scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal, issuing apologies carefully constructed to admit empathy without admitting guilt. Professors resigned. Trustees went silent. One dean issued a statement claiming they'd always supported Elijah's unique potential, prompting Lila to post screenshots of his earlier emails calling the boy a liability to departmental order. The lie collapsed before it finished echoing, but the world outside the courtroom wasn't offering silence. It was offering opportunity. And this time, not quietly, Oxford sent an invitation, full scholarship, personal mentorship, and guaranteed entry into their youth research initiative. The University of Tokyo followed. So did MIT. A Swedish math consortium even proposed relocating Elijah and Alessia entirely, a fresh start, away from the weight of what had been done to them. Every offer came with prestige, funding, freedom, but none came without motive. Behind every smiling envelope and elegant font was the same message. Repackaged. We see you now. Let us be the first to say we always did. Alessia read every letter with surgical precision. She weighed tone, read subtext. She knew which institutions wanted to uplift Elijah, and which wanted to launder their complicity through association. But she let Elijah choose, not because she was tired, but because choice was the one thing he had been denied most. I want to stay here, he said one night, softly. Not forever, just long enough to build something that's mine. Alessia nodded, eyes glassy. Then we stay, but only on our terms. The government launched a formal inquiry into the Elijah Protocol, now renamed by the media as the Academic Disappearance Doctrine. Senators held hearings. Think tanks published papers. Documentaries were greenlit within weeks. But none of it changed what Elijah had endured, and more importantly, it didn't stop it from happening again. Because while the world was watching, Elijah wasn't rebuilding trust. He was building math, and his equations had shifted. He no longer solved for elegance. He solved for exposure. Each formula he wrote was a defiance, not because it was correct, but because it was unapproved brilliance. His newest work didn't resemble traditional proofs. It looked like systems, like ethical algorithms, that predicted educational bias before it happened. One of his models demonstrated how regional school funding formulas could map racial underrepresentation 3 years in advance. A tech startup offered him millions for it. He declined. This isn't for sale, he told Marcus. It's a warning. His notebooks, once crowded with academic theory, now looked like battle maps. Each line of code, each probability structure, felt like a fingerprint, not of one boy's mind, but of every mind that had been muted before him. And still, the backlash simmered. A conservative commentator published a viral video calling Elijah a product of media manipulation, accusing Alessia of exploiting the system for fame and sympathy. She didn't respond. She didn't have to. The footage was already out there, unedited, undeniable. But even as the world bent toward their truth, the tension inside Elijah didn't soften. His mind had survived, but trust had not. He questioned every handshake. He walked faster past faculty offices. He refused interviews that requested smiling photos or hopeful angles. He knew how easily people wrote narratives around survival, how quickly pain became a footnote once it made others feel inspired. So when the awards came, and they did come, he didn't accept them on stage. He mailed a handwritten note. Your recognition came after your silence. I won't carry your applause. But what did move him, what reached him through the fog of data, math and institutional noise, was the letters. Hundreds of them. From children, from parents, from students who said, I was you. They tried to slow me down too. I stopped raising my hand in 2nd grade, because they said I was arrogant. I got suspended for correcting a teacher. One line stood out most, scribbled on lined paper by a 5th grader in Texas. They told me I was too loud in math. Now I know it was because I was right. That, more than all the algorithms in his mind, made Elijah look up from his desk. He was no longer solving alone. He was part of something bigger. And still, the world had one last twist left. On a cloudy afternoon, during a quiet walk back from the library, Elijah and Alessia passed a group of tourists who had clearly just visited the university. One of them, a woman with a camera and a voice dripping with casual arrogance, pointed at him without realizing who he was. There's the boy from the video, she whispered to her friend. He was never supposed to make it. Alessia froze mid-step. Elijah stopped too, not because the words stung, but because they confirmed everything he already knew. He looked over his shoulder, met her gaze, didn't blink, didn't smile, just let the silence answer for him. because he had made it. And that was the problem. They hadn't planned for what would happen after. If this story shook something in you, even for a moment, type yes in the comments. Have you ever seen brilliance get buried just because it didn't fit the system's idea of who deserves to succeed? Subscribe if you believe stories like this shouldn't be ignored. They should be amplified. Because until every voice is heard, none of us are truly free.